Prince Harry landed in Britain alone. No Meghan, no Archie, no Lilibet. And before the court could decide whether he was right about the tabloids, before the headlines could turn into a legal victory or another public defeat, the first verdict of the day had already arrived. Not from a judge, from his own father's palace. Because the emotional twist in this story is not simply that Harry is back in the United Kingdom. It is not simply that he is waiting for a major decision in one of the most explosive privacy battles against the British press. It is this. The son came home, and the door was closed before he even got to the courtroom. Buckingham Palace had previously offered him accommodation in a royal residence. Then that offer was withdrawn. The official explanation, according to reports, was timing. Harry had supposedly responded too late. Arrangements could not be made. Protocol could not be adjusted. Staff could not be moved around in time.
But sources cited by the Telegraph have suggested something far colder, that the decision had the approval of King Charles himself. And that changes everything. Because if this was just a diary problem, it would be a small royal inconvenience. If this was just a late email, it would be another awkward scheduling detail in a family that seems to communicate more through offices than through living rooms. But if the king knew, if the king approved it, if the king let the offer disappear while his son was on the way back to Britain, then this becomes a message. A message from father to son. You may be back in the country, but you are not back inside the family. And the timing could hardly be more brutal, because just hours after this accommodation drama erupted, Harry was due to face the other half of the day, a High Court decision in his case against Associated Newspapers, the publisher of the Daily Mail.
A case brought by Harry, Elton John, David Furnish, Elizabeth Hurley, Sadie Frost, Doreen Lawrence, and Simon Hughes. A case built around allegations of unlawful information gathering, including claims of phone tapping, deception, and intrusion into private lives. Associated Newspapers denies wrongdoing. The publisher has fought the case hard. The legal costs are enormous, reported at roughly tens of millions of pounds. The reputational stakes are even bigger. So Harry is not just returning to Britain for a ceremony or a family visit. He is returning into a storm. On one side, the palace. On the other, the press. The two forces that have shaped almost every public chapter of his adult life. And on this one day, both of them are waiting for him. That is what makes this moment different from the usual royal drama. This is not just another headline about whether Harry and Charles will meet. It is not another recycled argument about whether Meghan should have come, whether William will speak to him, whether the brothers can ever repair the damage. Those stories matter, but they have been told again and again. This one is sharper. Because the image is simple, and it is devastating. A prince comes home alone. His wife and children stay thousands of miles away because he says he cannot guarantee their safety in the country where he was born. He asks to stay in a royal residence. The offer vanishes. And then, almost immediately, he must wait to learn whether a court will give him the one thing the palace has rarely given him in public: validation. That is the double stake of this day. Personal humiliation in the morning, a possible legal reckoning in the afternoon. And if you are following the Sussex story, or even if you are tired of it, this is the part that is hard to ignore. Because for years, Harry has said that the same forces keep repeating themselves. The press invades, the palace manages, the family distances itself. The story gets written without him. Then everyone acts surprised when he fights back. But today, those themes are not spread across years. They are compressed into hours. The palace decision matters because it strikes at the deepest emotional symbol in the royal story. Home. Not titles, not seating plans, not balcony appearances. Home. For most people, accommodation is practical. A hotel room, a spare bedroom, a place to sleep after a long flight. But for Harry, royal accommodation is never just accommodation. It is access. It is recognition.
It is whether the institution still sees him as family or only as a problem to be handled. And that is why the phrase, "too late," lands so strangely here. Too late to arrange a room for the son of the king? Too late inside a palace system that can coordinate state visits, military ceremonies, banquets, security teams, and global events with minute-by-minute precision? Maybe that is technically true. Maybe the formal explanation is exactly what happened. Maybe the office did need more time, and maybe Harry's response really did arrive after the machinery had moved on. But emotionally, the public hears something else. Too late to come back. Too late to be trusted. Too late to be treated as part of the inner circle. And that is the kind of message that does not need to be written down to be understood. What makes it even colder is what seemed to be happening only days earlier. Not long ago, the conversation around Charles and Harry looked different. There were reports of a possible thaw, reports that Charles had offered accommodation and security support, partly in the hope of seeing his grandchildren. For a brief moment, the story had the shape of an olive branch. A father with cancer, a son living overseas, two young grandchildren who have barely had a relationship with their royal grandfather, a family separated not just by distance, but by lawsuits, interviews, memoirs, briefings, counter-briefings, security arguments, and years of public suspicion. In that context, the offer of a place to stay carried emotional weight. It suggested that maybe, behind the palace walls, someone understood that reconciliation cannot happen if every visit feels like a negotiation with lawyers and security officers. Then, within days, that tone changed. The branch became a closed door. And that is the whiplash at the center of this story. One week, the king appears to be making space for his son and grandchildren. The next, Harry is back in Britain by himself, with no family around him, and the palace accommodation is no longer available. That shift is why this does not feel like routine logistics. It feels like a signal sent at the worst possible moment. Because think about the optics. Harry is already in one of the most vulnerable positions he can occupy publicly. He has returned to the country where his popularity has fallen, where the press watches every movement, where parts of the public see him as a traitor, parts see him as a victim, and parts simply want the whole saga to end. He arrives without Meghan, which immediately fuels speculation. He arrives without Archie and Lilibet, which brings the security issue back to the surface. He arrives before a major court decision, which reminds everyone of his long war with the tabloids. And then the palace story breaks. Not a reunion, not a quiet, private stay, not a photograph of father and son, a revoked offer. That is the first image of the visit. And in royal storytelling, the first image matters. If you find this kind of royal power drama useful, stay with this, because the real question is not whether Harry got a room. The real question is whether the palace just made his argument for him. For years, Harry has claimed that there is a pattern. He says he is expected to expose himself and his family to risk, then accept whatever treatment the institution decides is convenient. He says the system protects itself first. He says private pain is managed as public relations. And now, as he returns alone because of security fears, the very institution that once was his home appears to tell him, "You cannot stay here." That is why this story cuts deeper than another family disagreement. It is almost too symbolic. Harry says Britain is not safe enough for his wife and children without proper protection. He comes alone. The palace refuses him accommodation. Then the court weighs whether the press crossed illegal lines while chasing stories about him and others. Every piece points to the same question. What happens when the people and institutions that are supposed to protect privacy, family, and dignity become the very forces a person feels he has to fight? Now, to be fair, the palace side of the story is not complicated on paper. They can say an offer was made, the Duke did not accept in time, and once he changed course, the practical arrangements could not be revived. That explanation gives everyone a clean, administrative version of events. No drama, no punishment, no emotional meaning. But royal stories are never only administrative. That is the problem. When Buckingham Palace acts, people read symbolism into it because the monarchy itself is built on symbolism. A balcony appearance means something. A seat in the second row means something. A carriage position means something. A Christmas invitation means something. A missing photograph on a table means something. So when the king's younger son is reportedly denied a place in a royal residence on the day he returns to Britain, people are obviously going to ask what that means. And the answer many will hear is simple. The relationship is colder than the palace wants to admit.
This is especially powerful because Harry did not arrive with the full Sussex machine around him. He arrived alone. That matters emotionally. Whether you admire him or dislike him, the image of a man returning to his birthplace without his wife and children because he says he fears for their safety is very different from the image of a celebrity couple staging a public comeback. There is no family tableau here. There is no smiling arrival. There is no sense of triumph. There is just a man walking back into the country that made him, the press that pursued him, and the family that still does not seem ready to fully receive him. And that loneliness is the emotional engine of the entire video. Because Harry's critics will say, he created this. He left royal duties. He gave interviews. He wrote spare. He attacked the institution and then expected royal privileges. They will say the palace owes him nothing, and that if he wants independence, he has to accept the consequences of independence. That argument is real, and a lot of people believe it. But Harry's supporters will say, he did not ask for a public parade. He asked for security. He asked for a safe way to bring his children to see their grandfather. He asked, in this moment, for a place to stay inside the family system he was born into. And the answer he got was no. That is why the story splits the audience so effectively. It lets everyone see what they already believe, but it also forces one uncomfortable image on both sides. A father has a palace. His son came home, and the son was not staying there. There are very few royal images more emotionally loaded than that. Now layer the court case on top of it, and the day becomes even more charged. Because the lawsuit against Associated Newspapers is not just another celebrity privacy claim. It is part of Harry's larger crusade against the British tabloid industry, the fight he has framed as almost existential. For Harry, the press is not an annoyance. It is not just bad coverage. It is a force he has linked to trauma, paranoia, broken trust, the collapse of relationships, and the death of his mother. He has spoken again and again about how the media shaped his life before he was old enough to control his own story. So when he fights the tabloids, he is not just fighting articles. He is fighting the machine that, in his view, turned private suffering into public entertainment. That is why the timing of this ruling matters so much. If he wins, or even if the court allows key parts of his arguments to stand in a meaningful way, it gives him something he has been chasing for years, a public institution saying that the press may have gone too far. Not an interview, not a memoir claim, not a Netflix edit. A court process. But if the decision goes against him, the damage could be severe. Because then the headlines write themselves. Harry loses again. Harry's war on the press collapses. Harry returns to Britain alone, denied palace accommodation, and leaves without the legal victory he wanted. That is the knife edge. This day could make him look vindicated, or it could make him look more isolated than ever. And that is exactly why the accommodation story is not a side note. It is the emotional frame around the verdict. Without it, the court decision is legal, technical, expensive, complicated. With it, the decision becomes part of a much larger human story. A man rejected by his family waits to see if the justice system will recognize the damage done by the press.
That is a much stronger story than Prince Harry attends court-related news. It is a collision. Family betrayal on one side, systemic revenge on the other. And even the word revenge is complicated here, because Harry would likely say this is not revenge at all. He would say it is accountability. He would say the press has operated for too long with impunity, protected by money, influence, and public appetite. He would say that if people knew how stories were really gathered, they might understand why he took such extreme steps to protect his wife and children. But to his critics, it looks like revenge. It looks like a prince who left the institution, but continues to use courts, interviews, and public statements to fight every enemy from his past. The palace, the tabloids, the government, the security committee, the editors, the anonymous sources. And that tension is what keeps people watching, whether they are rooting for him or against him. Because Harry is one of the rare public figures whose victories and defeats are both treated as entertainment. If he wins, half the audience says, "Finally, he was right." If he loses, the other half says, "Finally, he has been humbled." Either way, the machine feeds. And that is the tragic irony at the heart of the whole story. Harry's fight against the tabloids becomes another tabloid event. His attempt to control the narrative becomes another round of speculation. His return home becomes another public drama about who offered what, who refused whom, who knew, who approved, who briefed, and who benefits. Even the closed palace door becomes content, which is exactly why today matters. Because for once, the story is not just about what Harry says happened. It is about what institutions do in public view. The palace has acted. The court will act. The press will react. And Harry, once again, is in the middle of all three. But before we get to the courtroom, we have to understand the first blow of the day. Why the palace refusal lands so hard, and why the official explanation may be less important than the emotional message it sends. The palace version is tidy. Harry was offered a royal residence. His team did not confirm in time. When he later asked to use it, the offer was no longer available. That is the kind of explanation that sounds reasonable if you keep it inside the language of offices, calendars, and procedure. But nobody experiences this story as a calendar problem. They experience it as a father and a son. That is the trap for Buckingham Palace. The more it tries to make the story smaller, the bigger it becomes. Because the public does not imagine a spreadsheet. The public imagines gates, guards, rooms, corridors, family portraits, and a son who used to live inside that world, being told he cannot stay there now. And when a monarchy depends on emotional symbolism, it cannot suddenly ask people to see only logistics. This is why the timing hurts so much. Harry did not request some ordinary favor during a quiet week. He came back at a moment when his entire public argument was on trial. He has spent years saying that the press made his life unsafe, that the palace did not protect him properly, and that the system around the family always found a way to protect itself first. Then, on the day that a court is expected to decide whether part of his tabloid case holds up, the palace gives him a fresh example of distance. That does not automatically prove Harry right. It does not prove intent. It does not prove punishment. But it gives the story a shape that is impossible to ignore. The shape is this. Harry comes home alone, asking for safety and recognition, and receives neither. Now, that is the emotional story. But the practical story matters too, because the security issue is not a side detail. It is the reason Meghan and the children are not central characters in this visit. Harry has said many times that he does not feel able to bring his family to the United Kingdom without proper protection. After he and Meghan stepped back from royal duties, the automatic level of state-funded police protection changed. Since then, security has become one of the hardest, coldest arguments in the entire Sussex saga. It is easy to reduce that argument to money. It is easy to say, if Harry is rich, he can pay. It is easy to say, if he left, he left. But that misses why this issue is so emotional for him. For Harry, security is tied to memory. It is tied to what happened to Princess Diana. It is tied to the feeling that cameras, cars, leaks, and obsession can become dangerous when they are allowed to spiral. Whether people agree with his legal arguments or not, that fear is not abstract to him. It is part of his childhood. So when Harry says he will not bring Meghan, Archie, and Lilibet without guaranteed protection, he is not just making a political complaint. He is drawing a line around his family, and that line has consequences. It means Charles does not see his grandchildren. It means the public does not see a family reunion. It means every return to Britain becomes smaller, lonelier, more tense. It means the possibility of reconciliation is trapped behind one question: can Harry feel safe in the country that still calls him a prince? That is why the withdrawn accommodation offer hits so hard. The palace could have used this visit to soften the image. It could have created the impression that, despite everything, the family door was not completely closed. Even a quiet stay, with no photo and no statement, would have carried meaning. Instead, the public got the opposite. If you are watching this and thinking, but Harry rejected the palace first, that is exactly why this story is messy. Reports differ in tone, and both sides have incentives to frame the timeline in their favor. Palace sources can emphasize that he did not accept quickly enough. Harry's side can emphasize that he later accepted, that private security arrangements had been made, and that the withdrawal came at a critical moment. That is how modern royal conflict works. The argument is rarely fought directly. It is fought through timing, through sources, through small details that become moral claims. Was he too late, or was he pushed away? Was the palace being practical, or was it being cold? Was Charles protecting the institution, or rejecting his son? Those questions are why this story is more powerful than another headline about a possible meeting. Because a meeting can be denied, delayed, or kept private. But a revoked invitation creates a public symbol. It lets everyone project the whole family rupture onto one object. A room that was offered, then not offered. And now the court case gives that symbol a second meaning. Because what is Harry fighting in court? At the broadest level, he is fighting over access. Access to private information. Access to phone messages. Access to medical records. Access to movements, conversations, relationships, and the hidden parts of public lives. The claimants allege that illegal methods were used to gather information. Associated Newspapers denies the allegations and says its journalism was lawfully sourced. So the court is not simply deciding who gets money. It is deciding how far the press was allowed to go, and whether the stories that shaped famous lives were built on lawful reporting or something darker. For Harry, that question is personal, because the tabloids did not just report on his life, they helped define him. The wild prince, the spare, the angry son, the husband under Meghan's influence, the traitor, the victim, the hypocrite. Every era of his life has had a tabloid character attached to it. And once a character is attached, it becomes very hard for the person underneath to breathe. That is why a win in this case would mean more than damages. It would let Harry say, "Look closer at the machine that built the version of me you think you know." And that is also why a loss would be so damaging. Because his critics would not treat it as a narrow legal outcome. They would treat it as a referendum on his credibility. They would say the court rejected the story. They would say the prince who accused the press could not prove enough. They would say he built his new public life on grievance. And now, the grievance has collapsed. That may not be a fair reading of a complex legal judgment, but it is how headlines work. And Harry knows that better than almost anyone.
This is the brutal thing about fighting tabloids. Even the legal process becomes material for the same ecosystem you are trying to challenge. Every claim becomes a headline. Every denial becomes a headline. Every old friendship, old message, old article, old contradiction, old photograph, old private detail becomes part of the public fight.
During this case, the court has heard about old stories, alleged methods, disputed evidence, private investigators, and the credibility of key figures. The publisher has rejected the claims. The claimants have argued that there was a pattern. The judge now has to deal with law, evidence, limitation issues, credibility, and proof. But the public story will be much simpler. Harry wins, or Harry loses. That is how the machine will package it, and that is why the palace refusal feels almost cruelly timed. Because whatever happens in court, the emotional framing has already been written. Harry did not return as a reconciled son. He returned as an outsider. He returned without his family. He returned to fight the press while the palace kept him at arm's length. In one sense, the palace and the tabloids are completely different institutions. One is a constitutional monarchy. The other is a commercial media empire. One speaks in silence, protocol, and carefully placed sources. The other speaks in headlines, outrage, and speed. But in Harry's life, they have often worked like two sides of the same pressure system. The palace wants control. The press wants access. Harry wants protection. And those three desires cannot all win at the same time. When the palace controls the image, Harry feels silenced. When the press gets access, Harry feels exposed. When Harry demands protection, the institution feels challenged. That is the triangle he has been trapped in for years. And on this one day, the triangle becomes visible again. Charles is not giving him the image of welcome. The court is deciding whether the press crossed legal lines. Harry is standing between them, still trying to prove that the story told about him was never the whole truth. If this is the kind of deeper royal analysis you want, subscribe, because the surface version of this story is easy. The deeper version is where the real drama is. The palace door, the courtroom door, and the question of who gets to decide what Harry's life means. Now there is another reason this day is so important. It comes at a time when the public has started to feel exhausted by the Sussex saga. For some viewers, every Harry story sounds the same now. Another complaint, another lawsuit, another briefing, another family tension, another claim that the palace was cold or the press was cruel, or both. That fatigue is real. But this story cuts through the fatigue because it has a clean, emotional structure. Morning, the family door closes. Afternoon, the legal door may open. That is why it works as a video. It is not scattered. It is not 10 disconnected royal updates stitched together. It is one day with two verdicts. The first verdict is unofficial. It comes through the palace. It says, at least symbolically, "You are outside." The second verdict is official. It comes through the court. It may say, "Your fight against the press was justified." Or it may say, "You did not prove enough." And between those two verdicts is the entire Harry story. A boy born inside a palace, a man pursued by cameras, a son who lost his mother, a prince who left, a husband who says he had to protect his wife, a father who will not bring his children back without security, an exile who still keeps returning to the place that wounded him. That is why, even after all the interviews and all the lawsuits, people keep watching. Because under the celebrity noise, there is still a human question. What does a person do when the place they call home no longer feels safe, but still has the power to define them? And today, Harry is living that question in public again. The palace may believe it is simply enforcing procedure, but procedure can still wound. A family can hide behind rules. An institution can call something logistical when it lands like rejection.
And a father can avoid making a dramatic statement while still sending a message that everyone understands. That does not mean Charles is the villain of the story. It means the monarchy has a particular talent for turning human conflict into institutional silence. And silence is not neutral when everyone is listening. For Charles, this is delicate too. He is the king. He is not just a father. He has constitutional responsibilities, public optics, advisors, security concerns, and a monarchy still trying to steady itself after years of transition. Any move toward Harry can be read as weakness by some, compassion by others, and betrayal by others still. If he welcomes Harry too openly, critics ask why the Duke gets royal privileges after attacking the family. If he keeps Harry at a distance, critics ask what kind of father refuses shelter to his son. There may be no clean move available, but that is exactly why the choice of accommodation matters.
It was a small enough gesture to avoid a major public reunion, but meaningful enough to soften the story. A room would not have fixed the family. It would not have solved the security dispute. It would not have healed Spare, Oprah, Netflix, the lawsuits, or years of mistrust. But it would have said, not everything is frozen. Instead, the message that reached the public was colder, and now the court case carries more emotional weight than it otherwise would, because if Harry receives a favorable ruling, the day flips. Suddenly, the story is not just rejected son, it becomes rejected son wins against the tabloids. The palace may have denied him space, but the court gave him standing. The family may have kept him outside, but the legal system heard him. That would be a powerful narrative shift. It would not fix his relationship with Charles. It would not bring Meghan and the children onto British soil. It would not end the public debate about whether Harry is brave, bitter, hypocritical, or justified. But it would give him something rare: momentum. And for Harry, momentum matters because so many recent stories have made him look trapped. Trapped between America and Britain. Trapped between royal status and private life. Trapped between wanting privacy and needing publicity to fight for it. Trapped between wanting reconciliation and continuing to pursue battles that make reconciliation harder. A court victory would not remove those contradictions, but it would let him say, "This is why I kept going." On the other hand, if the ruling goes against him, the day becomes much darker. Then, the palace rejection is not balanced by legal vindication. It becomes part of a larger image of defeat. Harry alone in Britain. Harry without his family. Harry unable to stay in a royal residence. Harry losing ground in the battle against a newspaper group he is accused of serious wrongdoing. And the tabloids would not have to work hard to make that story hurt. They already know the character. They helped build it. That is the cruelty of the entire situation. Harry is fighting to escape a narrative, but every outcome gives the narrative more material. So the question for the audience is not simply, do you believe Harry? The sharper question is, what would count as proof after 20 years of public storytelling? If a court supports him, will his critics change their minds? If a court rejects him, will his supporters abandon him? Probably not, because by now, Harry is not just a person in the public imagination. He is a symbol people use to argue about family, duty, privilege, trauma, media power, racism, monarchy, masculinity, marriage, money, and whether leaving a system means you are free from it. That is a lot for one man to carry. And it is even more complicated because Harry is not a clean hero. He is privileged. He is wealthy. He has made money from telling his story. He has exposed private family pain while asking for privacy. He has made choices that hurt people. He has also endured levels of surveillance, intrusion, and public judgment most people cannot imagine. Both things can be true. That is what makes the story durable. If he were only a victim, the story would be simple.
If he were only a hypocrite, the story would be simple. But he is both wounded and powerful, both exposed and strategic, both outside the monarchy and permanently shaped by it. And today, that contradiction is standing in the open. The palace says, in effect, there is no room. The court says, in effect, we will decide what the evidence proves. The press says, in effect, every second of this is a story. And Harry says, through his actions, I am still not done fighting. That is where the emotional twist becomes bigger than the news cycle. Because this is not just about one night in a palace. It is about whether Harry can ever return to Britain without being reduced to a problem. A security problem, a public relations problem, a constitutional problem, a tabloid problem, a family problem. At some point, a person starts to wonder whether home is a place you can be denied by email. And that is the line that will stay with people. Not the legal costs, not the procedural explanation, not even the exact court language. The image. He came back alone, and the door was closed. That is why the final hours of this day matter. If the court gives Harry a win, he walks away with a rare kind of public answer. Not forgiveness, not reconciliation, but recognition. A sign that at least one institution was willing to examine the machinery around him and say the allegations deserved weight. If the court does not, then the palace refusal becomes even heavier. Because then, Harry's day is defined by two closed doors. One at the palace, one in court. Either way, this is not just another royal update. This is a pressure point in the entire Sussex story. It brings the private and public battles together so tightly that you cannot separate them. The father who will not host him. The press, he says, hunted him. The court that may decide whether he has been right to keep fighting. And the family he left across the ocean because he says Britain is still not safe enough for them. That is why the absence of Meghan and the children matters so much. Sometimes the most important people in a story are the ones who are not in the room. Their absence explains the stakes better than any statement. Harry is not just fighting for himself as a prince with a bruised ego. In his version of the story, he is fighting as a husband and father, trying to prevent history from repeating itself. You can agree with that or reject it, but you cannot understand this day without it. Because if Archie and Lilibet had arrived with him, the story would have been different. It would have been reunion speculation, grandfather photographs, family optics, maybe even a softening of the feud. But they are not there. Meghan is not there. The family image is missing, and in its place is a legal image. Harry versus the publisher. Harry versus the palace narrative. Harry versus the version of himself that has been sold for decades. That is a much colder story, but it is also much more revealing. So now the day comes down to this. The palace has already delivered its message, whether it meant to or not. The press is already circling because every possible outcome is useful to somebody. And the court decision will determine whether Harry gets to leave this chapter with proof or whether his critics get another weapon. Tell me in the comments which verdict you think matters more, the private one from his father or the public one from the court. Because the strange thing is, the legal verdict may dominate the headlines, but the emotional verdict may last longer. And if you think this is just another family feud, look at the sequence one more time. The son returns alone. The palace withdraws the place to stay. The judge weighs the case against the tabloids. The wife and children remain far away. The father is silent. The newspapers wait. That is not random drama. That is the whole modern royal crisis in one day. The monarchy wants dignity without mess. The tabloids want access without consequence. Harry wants protection without silence. and none of those wants can peacefully fit together anymore. So whatever the court decides, this day will leave a mark. If Harry wins, it will be remembered as the day he was denied the palace but gained ground against the press. If he loses, it will be remembered as the day he came home alone and found no shelter. Not from family, not from the system, not from the headlines. That is why the story feels bigger than a room. Because sometimes, a room is never just a room. Sometimes it is a test of whether you are still family. Sometimes it is a symbol of whether the institution can show mercy without admitting fault. Sometimes it is the difference between a visit and an exile. And for Prince Harry, on this day, the room he did not get may define the verdict before the judge even speaks.